This weekend in St. Louis is Gay Pride Fest. So many buildings downtown, I noticed this past week, were lit up with the colors of the rainbow. Just last Friday, as you all know, our Supreme Court made an historic decision that all human beings, no matter their orientation, have the right to marriage. Hundreds of posts on Facebook are their old traditional portraits, but this time with rainbow colors across the top. Now, some in the church were quick to object. Others in the church were dancing in the street. While it would take society and the church a long time to figure all this out, it's all so new. One thing I hope does not take a long time, and perhaps, as a matter of fact, is changing already right in front of our very eyes, is to somehow figure out how to support and accept those who are coming to terms with their own same-sex attraction. It's a big part of growing up, you know. Those who are coming out. As you likely know, it's a struggle. It's a mighty struggle for young women and men to come to grips with who they are and how they are in the world. And as I said before, I've spent my life with too many young women and men who've used words like tormented, when it came to coming to grips with their fear that they might be gay. Tormented. The shame that so many of us have never had to experience is their cross. And it's a big one. So big that when kids identify as potentially gay, when they start to notice this in themselves, they have 25% more likelihood of committing suicide than the rest of us, where only 4% of us. 4 to 25%. It's a process, as you can imagine, therefore, that is fraught with letting goes and judgment and shame. As a matter of fact, we at the CSC have been hosting over the last few years an ongoing conversation every other week that we call Gay and Spiritual. I'm sure you've heard it announced here. Just so that they can find meaning in this process and they can get closer to God in it, because their cross in coming out is truly His cross. Their suffering is His. And so we wanted to help that connection happen for them so that they can grow closer to Him, not farther away, in this process that is sometimes so full of shaming. This process of coming out begins with the excruciating process of them coming out first to themselves. The hardest, biggest first step. Coming to terms with that same-sex attraction. That's part of their inner work, and it's indispensable. It's absolutely necessary. And I have to say, I've personally, over these years, learned so much. I have learned so much and been so inspired from their suffering, and they're willing to make this journey, their struggle to come out first to themselves, to me, then in friendship and in family, and then perhaps to the world. Many, if not most of us, have closets, you know. We have our closets, and our closets are full to overflowing with skeletons of all sorts, with this shame or that, this embarrassment or that embarrassment. There are many things in our lives that can put us in that closet of embarrassment and shame, and no matter what the issue is, the process of coming out is always the same. It's always the same. First, we have to admit it to ourselves, then to trusted others, and then to the world. This reflection in the light of the Word of God this morning is not so much about that issue that's very much on the table for the whole world right now, and it's been the occasion for so many people to be so released. But rather, it's about another process of coming out, and it's the process of coming out that has to do with what we're like when we get sick. Perhaps for many of us, if not us ourselves, then for people around us, we make a secret out of our sickness sometimes. We get embarrassed when we get sick. Oftentimes, shame keeps us from sharing our illness, especially if we've been diagnosed with a chronic illness, with other people. We can see it as weakness, We're somehow weak here, and weakness is not something many of us like to admit. In the story of Jesus in Mark's Gospel that you just heard proclaimed, we see and hear of people who are sick, who are very sick. Illness is everywhere in these texts, in the first reading as well. And there are people who've experienced some shame because of that sickness. First, there was the story of the official in the synagogue. His daughter was terminally ill, he was found out. And he wants to help her, but he can't. He's helpless. So he does something unheard of. He swallows his pride and his shame, and he goes to this enemy of the synagogue, and he asks for help. He does that out loud in front of the world. He's coming out, really, with his illness of his daughter and taking a huge risk that he could be even more shamed because of this. But in that moment, because of his love, he came out. The second story happens in the midst of the first. It's this woman who was bleeding for years. And bleeding for the Jewish people was a condition of contagion. It was a condition of shame. It was an isolation. They were declared unclean, and anybody that came close to them would become unclean as well. She could not get help as hard as she tried. She was suffering, and so she had to hide it. To touch anyone would render them unclean, and so she took a huge risk. This woman, who probably everybody in town knew, had this disease, this sickness, ventured out into public, made her way through the crowd, because she somehow had confidence that this was the one who could help her. This is the one who could restore her dignity. And so in the midst of that crowd, she touches just the hem of his garment. In that moment, she came out. She told the whole world who she was and what her disease was, what she carried in her body. She knew it was necessary to come out if she ever wanted to be whole. The truth is, my friends, so many of us, but not all, suffer more from how we feel about our sickness than from the sickness itself. Too many of us are embarrassed to admit that we have a chronic illness, that we are indeed sick sometimes, even with just a cold. We can see our sickness as a weakness, an imperfection. And so to admit it to ourselves first of all, and then to others, is to risk being judged by others as somehow deficient. And all this complicates the process of healing. Jesus knows that. Because to remain in the closet about anything in our lives, anything, complicates the healing, the process of becoming whole, if it doesn't block it altogether. Like so many people, especially perhaps for our brothers and sisters who are gay, We do not realize the extent to which we have been leading for so long a double life. A double life. Many of us have been sick people posturing as healthy. And so we end up pushing ourselves for so long and pretending to the point of weariness our whole life, so that there end up being two people operating in my one body, and one of them is a liar. When we get sick, we need to come out to ourselves first, to recognize the fact that each of us needs to adjust the way we live, and we'll never begin to adjust until we admit the fact of our illness. As a matter of fact, sometimes our denial is so deep just because we don't want to change our behavior, the way we've been living. And I have to admit that certainly has been true of me. If you notice, most of what I preach about I'm guilty of. As many of you know, I was diagnosed several years ago now with diabetes 2. I realized for a long time that I had spent a lot of time and energy denying that chronic illness in my body rather than accept the fact of my forever changed body. And even though forming habits of rest, of nutrition, of exercise, and prayer would honestly support my recovering body and soul, and even though those things were essential, I won't even begin to do that, nor will any of us, if we don't acknowledge first the fact of our illness. I had to come out to myself as a person having diabetes. I had to accept the truth in love of myself, actually, just like my gay sisters and brothers have taught me so many times. And so let go of the behaviors that look like I'm passing for a person with no illness. In short, I became great at hiding it. That was all aggravated, of course, by another issue that I have, and that is going out to eat. And so much in me did not want to tell you this about me because I didn't want you to stop making those amazing desserts that you so carefully craft for me. And so I had to come out to you too. My friends, whether or not you're suffering from a temporary sickness or a chronic illness, you probably have had to deal with denial. It seems to be the first step all the time for us human beings. Denial in yourself or in someone you love. It's a difficult thing to admit that our bodies are not completely healthy. As I said before, if this is not your issue, trust me, it's an issue for many people you love. If you care for them, you have to confront the denial. You caregivers as well. If you're somebody who's embarrassed by your sickness, if you want to come out of that denial closet about your illness, talk about it with someone whom you think will accept and understand. Journal about it. Read up on it. I remember the first time I told anybody that I was diagnosed with diabetes. The person burst into tears. Well, I guess I could have taken that as a sign of compassion, but I thought, oh my gosh, this is worse than I thought. That's true. And I want to add, we Catholics have two extraordinary gifts to help in this process that heals. One is the sacrament of confession, where we can come out with this darkest secret in this safe place, guaranteed, assured. We have that available to us. Every single person here, you don't have to pay $150 an hour for that. Totally. And we have the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. It's a beautiful, beautiful sacrament. Takes about 7 minutes, really. But I highly, highly recommend that you make the choice to ask for that for yourself. Not long ago, out in the backyard on a Tuesday night, we celebrated the sacrament of the sick with some students. I guess there were maybe 50 students here that day, and I can tell you that it was really, really a hard decision for those young people in a culture that prizes health and fitness and beauty and all those other things to stand up in front of their peers and say, I'm sick. It was truly a coming out moment for them. It was very vulnerable. Some couldn't do it. The ones who came out that day changed the rest of our hearts. Their courage challenged all of us. I have to admit, I will never forget that afternoon. And I've anointed a lot of people. I'm just telling you, no matter the secret we keep in that closet, it's time to come out. And if we don't come out, we will never